Okay, welcome. Let's get this going. So we're on to week 10 and Lucretius. Lucretius, nice little Roman author, wanted to sort of encapsulate some of the ideas of prior scholars, including Epicurus, etc. Some areas of Stoicism in his writing, but I'll very simply say it's very nihilistic. I mean, it's a very modern philosophy, which is something a little bit different to many of the others, more so than people imagined. So not only does he talk about the conceptualization of reality in a way that we would see as modern, Lucretius goes further and talks about sort of the emptiness of life in a very nihilistic way, reminiscent of Nietzsche and the argument about God as dead. So in what we're going to discuss, we're talking about something where there shouldn't be any need, according to Lucretius, for anything outside of the existence of the universe. It's just here, it's just now, and at the end we all die and go and fall into particles, and that's the end. I mean, it's a very, very simple, empty thing. Now, the problem at the time was there are many parts of Rome, like now, that were materially wealthy, and because of that wealth, became a little bit decadent. And in that, like even throughout modernity in our modern world, the concept then becomes what else is there? And not everyone achieves what they want, and not everyone gets what they want. So what we end up with is a very modern version of disenchantment. And how do we basically get over that? Oh, just ignore existence and don't worry about it. She'll be right, mate. Australian in a way. So he has a very interesting verse. The writing is very sort of it's poetic, but well, at least it is in Latin. Doesn't always end up that way in English. And the underlying nature of many of the scientific principles we take are encapsulated. So it builds on some of the earlier Greeks, the sort of Democritus, etc. And it's also very dark, although he doesn't, I mean, as a Epicurean, I don't think he would believe it is. So we have really this concept of no one can be happy until you're at the end of your life. We saw that with Solon. But that doesn't mean that we should give up on the idea of life and happiness, etc. So, first of all, who's actually read this fully? Everyone go through the whole lot or just parts? I know Brendan probably did.
I listened to a 10-hour...
Listening's still just as good.
Is that good enough? Yeah.
Yep, listening's good. So what were your takeaways from this?
Oh, I thought it was pretty interesting how many of today's kind of laws of nature he sort of accurately constructed, you know, like conservation of matter, things like that. You know, it was very, you know, while some of the underlying things that he was using as his reasoning ended up being wrong, he still kind of the assumptions that he was making was still correct, which I thought was pretty impressive.
So some of what he's actually proposed is actually very cogent right now in the metaphysics that people call physics. A multiverse theory, for instance. Multiverse theory isn't science. Depending on who you talk to, they'll argue differently, but the reality is any proper philosophy of science will discard multiverse theory. It's metaphysics at best. It's more religion or theology, to tell you the truth. There's no way of testing it. There's no way of proving it. There's no evidence for it at all. There can never be any evidence for it. It's purely a belief structure, and there's actually a lot of evidence against it. I mean, it's very simple deductively to discredit it because the sort of thing is, oh, everything exists. So in an unbounded universe, the type that we have by Lucretius, it's infinite. It has to be infinite. Now, there's a problem with that. The universe isn't infinite. Now, it also gets rid of free will. I want you to think for a moment he wanted to introduce the equivalent of quantum theory, like randomness into the universe. But in an infinite universe, every random occurrence occurs. So we can say, but there's an infinite number of variations in how far you can actually go. And it might be very different at only a small point, but it's still different. And the answer there is, if it's infinite, it exists. It has existed. It exists an infinite number of times. So like in the Matrix, where he was in the room and yelling at himself on the screen, all of these things have happened before, an infinite number of times. That means we're not really here making decisions. We're going through the same things that we've done an infinite number of times. Personally, he said how that was actually a way of getting rid of despondency, but I actually find that hell. I mean, if you know that you're infinitely living a life of exactly the same things, no matter what you think you do, it's always the same, and that there's no way out, and it's purposeless. Well, that doesn't sound like a terribly ideal scenario to have a universe, in my opinion. I mean, now, where did it come from? Oh, it's infinite. There's not really a scientifically satisfying explanation either. I mean, it gets rid of, it's very Richard Dawkins in that you don't have God, or you don't have spirituality, or you don't have everything else. But it's basically, we got rid of God by making infinity. If you think about that for a moment, what is infinity? There's no infinity in our universe. There's not infinitely small, there's Planck length. Infinitely large we can't get to because the universe isn't infinite. So it might be really big and it might be really small, but there's no infinities here. They're just a mathematical abstraction, like Plato's figures, like his ideal forms. So we have now a system where spirituality is no longer required. But if we don't have that, and I'll even make the argument that at its roots, every dispute, every war, everything else is theological, in a way that it's always some difference of opinion. Otherwise, we would all just get along. It's not just power. People want power, but why? They want to implement their system. And they're not doing it because they want more. If they had an Epicurean ideal and they actually lived that way, then there's only so many yachts you can be on at a time. And even if you've got a flotilla of yachts and you've got 10 of them around you, you can't be on every one of those yachts simultaneously. You can be in one place at one time. So the problem with all of this is it leads to some very Machiavellian ideas. I mean, it's very ironic, and these people think that they are making it simple by getting rid of everything that causes problems, and what they end up doing is causing more problems. So it is, in my opinion, the roots of something like scientism. It's a religion of science, and Lucretius has one of the earlier forms of a scientistic religion. So he proselytizes a world without God or spirituality, but in that, why? The question then comes to, what is justice? Why are we doing things? We can't live and let live for everything. We have to make decisions. We have to make choices. We have to decide where we'll draw the line, what is acceptable and not. And the arguments against that are, oh, well, people have freedom, but people don't have freedom to rape or murder. And if they are, then they're interacting with someone else's freedom. So what we have is a scenario where we extend into a different world. So I'll even argue that in some ways, Lucretius was a deist. He doesn't necessarily go into the universe the way that we would with a god. It's more Jefferson's God, in that the universe itself is created and then stuff happens and God leaves and goes off and retires. I mean, Yep, made this universe. I'm just going to go and grab myself some golf pants and have a few rounds. I mean, that's the way that it works. So the interesting other part here is the title is also very unoriginal. So this is something that people today don't really understand. Empedocles and Epicurus wrote a treatise with the very same name, very same topics, and there are sections that are copied word for word. Well, or at least translated word for word, depending on which part. Now, similar things were done with Shakespearean verse. There's practically no Shakespearean play that is original. Caesar comes out of Plutarch, Coriolanus comes out of Plutarch, many others do. The difference is how. In the work of Shakespeare, he takes a story that is, I mean, if you've read Plutarch, you'll see that it's interesting, but it's not exactly what you would call entertaining. I mean, it's a good book. I mean, it covers a lot of things, and it is the histology and the study of history is good in some ways. I mean, I like it. I always enjoy Plutarch, but it's not something that you'd go and curl up on your pillow and read to be entertained. Whereas Shakespeare takes the works that are already there and imbibes them with character. So the characters are his. So as an example of that, I saw with my wife the movie Northman the other day. And I don't think everyone realizes, but it's actually the original story of Shakespeare's Hamlet, but done in a 9th century, 10th century type scenario as it would be. Everything's dirty, everything's wooden. There's no castles that are stone. Hamlet is a typical Viking because, well, he's a Danish king, and Danish 9th century kings were like that. So, I mean, you change it if you're Shakespeare because you put everyone in a 14th century environment, but that's not the reality. But you made it entertaining. So we also have that in Lucretius, and he makes a full account of a world that others don't really go into in any detail. So materialism is expanded, atomism is expanded, but rather than stopping at the description as we should in science, like many people even today, Lucretius takes it further. And he then says, if I can't measure it, then it mustn't exist. But then what is everything else? And there are no components that we know of in body or soul. And because we can't measure it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I know that's one that people love to say. I mean, we haven't found it, so therefore it doesn't exist. But we also hadn't found quantum particles. We hadn't found quarks. We still haven't actually really seen a quark. We've seen the interactions of quarks, but that doesn't mean that we have measured any of them. So scientifically, you can't actually discount something for that reason. The way that hypotheses and hypothesis testing work is you don't actually discard and say this is invalid and it doesn't exist. You say that the evidence supports the alternative. So that's something people should learn in university. You don't actually disprove anything with science. You provide evidence for a better explanation, and then you follow the better explanation. But you haven't actually removed any of these things. So going back to that, we also see some of the early alignments to Buddhist thought. Contrary to what many people think, there were lots of elements of spiritualism that aligned with the East in Rome at the time. Rome was very well connected to the rest of the world. They traded right to China. The pepper trades were extensive, for instance. So looking at all of this, it's interesting to see how much right now where people sort of talk about cultural appropriation and to note that, well, every single culture has appropriated every other culture. So get over it. So this brings me to what I would sum him up as. And I can say that in one word: nihilistic. He's like the majority of Buddhists out there. So to offend every Buddhist in the world, you're nihilistic. Your universe is empty. I'm sorry. There are no higher purposes. You should just live the best life you can now. And the universe will go on and keep happening again and again in this endless cycle of nothingness. Yip-de-doo-dah. So you can believe that. It's not mine. Book 1 and 2, we cover some interesting areas of materialistic and atomic nature. Some of the descriptions there were quite good for early non-scientific analysis. Book 3, the argument is the soul is made of atoms and disintegrates after death. But then the argument would be, where is the soul? We can't find an atomic soul. So we can say that it derives from complexity and that it's an emergent property, which again is an interesting way of explaining things. But what does it mean? So when someone tells you it's an emergent property, it sounds good, but what does it really mean? And this is part of the Silicon Valley mentality right now. They seem to believe if you stick enough computers together, then eventually an AI will appear. Why? Because emergent properties. There's complexity. The reality is the bottom of my coffee cup is more complex than the entirety of all systems in Silicon Valley that have existed and that will exist in the next 100 years. And yet my coffee cup hasn't sprouted intelligent life yet. I mean, if I leave it here another week, it might sprout life, but it won't be intelligent life. At least I don't believe so. Maybe we'll do that.
Bacteriophage in your milk begs to differ.
Yeah, so complexity doesn't just end up making something. I mean, pure randomness is complex, and it's difficult to describe. I mean, if you get a bag of M&Ms and you sort of separate the colors and then you mix them all up together, they're more complex. But yet, so what? So this is something we have people love to do this, and getting there also takes away part of humanity. So he goes on then to go on thought and reproduction. He's not really like many Epicureans. The sort of idea of sexual love is downplayed. We have to do it. In the British tradition, do one for England and do one for the Queen and drop a child, but don't enjoy it. That would be wrong. Rah, rah, British. Yeah. I'm Australian. I can make fun of this place. So the world and its origin, and then natural phenomena and randomness. But again, we get into this idea like beginnings, etc. And it had an interesting lot of potential. But again, getting away from trying to understand and embracing the philosophical or spiritual nature of things leads to emptiness. And I'll actually argue that from the changes in universities implemented in America first in 1958, trying to grow them in size, make them more equal, all this other stuff, we have changed the world from a system of sort of education into training. And in doing this, the same sort of problem as old Lucretius had, we stop exploring, we stop mysticism, we stop wonder. And old Einstein there was also a philosopher. Most people don't seem to remember that anymore. He didn't invent things because he worked in the Large Hadron Collider project. He didn't do it because he was empirical. He used his brain. He learned how to use the damn thing. And this is something that we seem to be forgetting. So just saying that things are purely random is a terrible explanation. I mean, it's worse than just saying, oh, God and the angels. Neither's actually satisfying. So, I mean, I might be Christian and have beliefs, but I'm really unsatisfied with an answer that says God did it. I'm really unsatisfied with an answer about it's random. My answer in both cases would be how, why, how do I repeat it, what were the conditions for it? For instance, we know that atomic structures decay at a sort of set Poisson rate that is approximately the same. I mean, and over time, it is the same, effectively. We know that if you are talking about the decay of certain types of uranium, it happens at a set rate. And particles randomly collide, they randomly decay. Why? Why do they do that? What is the interaction? And thinking larger thoughts might help us explain something. There's a reason that the 60s, after the change in education, created the last real advance in physics, which was the positing of the Higgs boson. After that, nothing's been discovered that is correct. And I'll actually go out on a limb and say the entirety of physics after that point has been bunk. Sorry, little tiny applied physics type things and better machines, but that's not science, that's technology, that's engineering. So like the Romans, we are getting really good at engineering. We're improving that, but we're forgetting the Greek aspect that started all of this, which is thought. We're starting to go back and forget that. And like Epicurus here, if we're going into failing to ask for explanations, then really, what do we have to be empirically tested? What do we have to try and find an answer to? Further, most people will never accept such a nihilistic world. Whether you like it or not, people have different religions, but they're not going to give up on their beliefs. And you can make fun and ridicule them all you want, but you don't have any better answers. So if you're going to go up to someone who's a Mormon or a Mohammedan, an Islamic person, or a Christian or a Catholic, they're sort of Christians. I grew up as one, so, and I'm Australian, so let's insult everyone. Then really, if you're giving an answer that is, I mean, if you're agnostic, I can understand the point, and Lucretius should have stopped there. But when you go beyond that, then you're offering explanations that become beyond scientific, and they become metaphysical at best and theological at worst, but without any spiritual benefit. So think about it for a moment. The universe always existed. How do you know that? It must have. Why? The great magic science book told me. I mean, it's not a good answer. It is not only unfulfilling, it is unscientific. So what we need to start doing is think beyond. So although Lucretius had some good ideas, he didn't take them anywhere. Why? Because, well, there is nothing more. And you see what happens when you start saying there is nothing more. You get this really good idea. You start with the basic of quantum physics and you go, yeah, but nothing exists. So stuff it. So 2,000 years ago, yeah, atomic theory, quantum physics, but we're all going to die and the universe is useless. Should we go invent something more? Nah, we're all going to die and the universe is useless. I mean, at the heart of it, that's the real problem with this. Now, ironically, as I've been saying, without speculation, we don't make theory. We can't just sit there with observation. The theory comes from human mind. To actually invent something, to create something, we need to go beyond merely seeking existence. To have other bits that I've talked about earlier in these sessions, we need to then think further into topics such as why. Why do we have justice? What is justice? How do we define this? And it's not just scientific. There are value decisions here. And you cannot measure someone's value against someone else's value just scientifically. I can't go and say, I happen to like Hieronymus Bosch, and I do. And I can't say, you shouldn't like Hieronymus Bosch. I also like Caravelli. And I can then go and go, well, yeah, you like later period post-studio Picasso. Yeah, you don't have any taste. Well, how? I mean, that's a different taste, but you can't, the fact that I like Caravelli or and you like Picasso, well, so what? If you see what I'm saying, it is purely aesthetics. Now, we can argue then, but this leads to everyone can have a different judgment and we can measure them. But how? Do we get into the origins of social justice theory of John Rawls? And do we then take property away from people? And if we do that, aren't we then having an argument that, well, why make property in the first place? If I'm going to have it taken away from me, why the hell would I work? So now, going back to old Lucretius and his idea of Lucretian space. So the universe of Lucretius fills some of the aspects of modern physics. Empty space, although quantum foam would say that it's not empty, is a medium of all things. We know that atoms exist. They change, they alter forms, but there are particles below them that may not. Now, Lucretius goes between a few different definitions. He looks at the universe as unbounded as well as infinite, always existing, etc. Those in themselves are problematic. Now, there are either two ways of looking at this. Either we haven't gotten to the end of the universe, so to speak, even if it's unbounded and continues forever, unbounded isn't infinite. It's a mistake people make. I'm never going to reach in infinity when I'm unbounded. The problems of Cantor sets and the infinite sets that sort of are paradoxical and contradictory do not occur when you're talking about unbounded mathematics. They only occur in infinite mathematics. And that might be a small problem that most people don't care about, but there are no contradictions in something that is unbounded but finite. Equally, infinite, there are always problems. Now, the thing is, if we're in an infinite universe, then everything's infinite, always. And if we're in an infinite universe, then everything must have already existed and will exist. And we only think that we are at a part. And then what does that mean? Are we then thinking something now that doesn't exist? What does that thought mean? So it brings up more problems than it solves. So it appears scientific, but it links into something like multiverse theory. And once we get into that, we get into scientific quackery. I know people love to make stories about it, but it is pure quackery. So later this year, I've got a dissertation coming out on time and space and fixing some of Einstein's problems, but that can wait till later. So
I feel like it's a bit interesting though, because if you say that the universe is infinite, you're kind of automatically discounting the fact that there could be a multiverse, because if the one that we're in now is everything, there cannot be anything outside of that. So how could there be another?
Not necessarily, because you just say that that's part of the same universe and that it goes through a series of rebounds infinitely, right. But or that all of these already exist as part of this universe. All possible universes exist. Now, that also gets into another problem. People love to say if everything exists, then there's a version of X that is good and Y that is bad, and every possible thing will exist. But infinity doesn't mean that everything possibly exists. And I'll give you an example. There are an infinite number of variables between the number 1 and 2. If we go in and we forget integer values and we go into nice long real numbers, we have an infinite number of numbers between the number 1 and 2. And guess what? None of those will ever equal the value 3. If we have a universe that is bounded between bottom 1 and top 2, then nowhere in that universe will the number 3 occur. So, contrary to what people think, just because even if you had an unbounded or infinite universe, that doesn't mean unicorns will pop up into existence. I mean, not impossible that a unicorn could occur, but there won't be a Pegasus, because there's no way on earth you're going to have a bloody flying horse. It doesn't make sense. I'm sorry. Anyway, so all things constantly change, are in motion, perpetually developing and reformulating. Back to our very Eastern philosophy. Contrary to what many people think, a lot of the Eastern philosophy actually came from what is now the Near East. The Chinese imported many of these concepts. The original Taoist idea was nowhere near the philosophical religion that it is now. Buddhism came from India, and many of the aspects of sort of the Hindu religion came from Persia. So we have areas that the Romans and the Greeks were in constant contact with. Remember, famous of Greeks, old Alexander the Great there, Alexander of Macedon went and trounced around the world and went over to India, had a couple battles with elephants, got really sick, had belly, went home, got died, basically, to summarize it. So in all of that, they also brought back a lot of ideas. So these ideas are not new. And those ideas from those areas, Persia and India, also went to China. And unfortunately, they also had a negative effect over some of the more rational areas like Confucian thought, and led to Taoism being corrupted. So this East versus West idea is wrong. I'm going to say it very simply. It's crap. The reality is there are logical, rational ideas, and there are romantic ideas. And even if we look through modern or more modern history, the authors such as Blake and others really embraced in their early proto-modernism concepts of sort of Eastern thought as it was then, but really romantic thought. And that's what we're looking at, romanticism versus rationalism. Now, the simple answer is neither is right, but both are right. So why I'm saying that is neither by themselves are right. What we need is a balance between the spiritual and the logical. And people don't seem to realize that logic and emotion and rationality in humanity is derived through a combination of logic and ethics and emotion and feeling. So to be logical and human, you actually need to put emotion into the equation. We're not measuring things purely objectively. We're going to always have our subjective feeling in this. And Lucretius seemed to want to get rid of some of that. It's a thing that people have, because wouldn't it be nice if we got rid of all of this horrible, horrible, mucky stuff, all of the emotions, all of the feelings? But the problem with that, and we saw it in Lenin, and we saw it with Mao, and we saw it with Stalin, and we saw it with Mr. Hitler. There's a big problem. When we get rid of the feelings that people are feeling, we're not getting rid of our feelings. What we're really doing is we're saying, I'm right, and everyone should align to what I believe. If you think about that for a moment, that's really what everyone did. Old Lenin there. I know best. My religion, communism, Marxist Leninist is communist. It's a religion. My religion is right. Worship. And then Stalin came along and modified a little bit and said, I'm the new Paul. I'm going to rewrite this Leninist Bible. Worship my way. And like every other sort of plutocratic theologian before him, he went off and he killed everyone who didn't agree, because that way you get agreement. Yay. So let's think about that for a moment when we're doing this. If we don't have these things, we end up with contradictions in our sort of non-contradictory universe. We need philosophical goals. We need something more. We can't just say that we're materialistic and the universe is materialistic. We need to think, we need to be. And this is the aspect of education that is currently missing. We're teaching people not to think. Universities used to be a place where people could go around and have a bit of time and not be too crowded and be bored, not be on drugs, actually be on their own mind. Think, pontificate. Those 3, 4, 5, 7, sometimes more, like weird people like me, years should be there as a time when you go off into the hustle, bustle, and burly world of reality, that you can look back and remember there's this bigger thing out there. And I remember I thought about this in the past. So it really comes down to imagining more. Though Lucretius wants us to think about the material parts, but why? Why are we doing something? Why do we choose something? So the pathetic fallacy is mentioned, the fallacy of emotions and feeling. Whatever things we perceive to have sense, you must admit to be composed of senseless first beings. Why must I admit that? I mean, if I say there's nothing more in the universe because I haven't seen it, I haven't seen an atom. Well, technically I have. I actually did a experiment 14 years ago based on a scanning electron microscope where I measured the effects of sort of particles and rewriting on hard drives. But then did I really see an atom? I saw what a computer screen said was an atom. But again, did I see it? I mean, if it's on my computer screen, is that really seeing? So lots of little questions. So Epicureans like to say that there are no purposes or reason. It goes beyond even the Marcus Aurelius, the Stoics of the world. It's not merely that there isn't any value, but we shouldn't really go into any values at all. Why then do we have art? Why high art? I mean, it's a very middle-class bourgeois, to sound a little bit Marxist in this, horrible idea of nothingness. And that's part of the problem we have right now. So humanity needs to actually interact with something more. We need to have something more. So practical motivations matter. Moral grounds. So why do we choose one moral over another? Should we all just be utilitarians? In the worst sense of utilitarian. I mean, if the average person gets a lot of sort of enjoyment out of drugs, shouldn't we just drug them? I mean, isn't that what Huxley had in A Brave New World? Why don't we just give everyone soma? Why don't we make them happy? Can't we give them Valium and calm them down? And can't we give them uppers to up them? And wouldn't that, why not? I mean, if that's our goal, why not? Why wouldn't we do that? I mean, in a purely utilitarian argument, I can't see a problem.
Doesn't really make them happy, though. It just helps them forget the struggle.
Well, make better drugs. I mean, there are drugs out there that send you into all different things. Yes, there are downers when you're off them, but don't go off them. I mean, isn't that the argument? So we don't have emotion without logic. We don't have, I mean, in a passion life, a computer life isn't actually valid. We need more. So we need to find the aesthetic region, the spiritual. And this is the irony in architecture from the 60s in many ways, was that the people who architected many of the ugly buildings that they said were functional never lived in them. I think if we actually had people in England having to live in the damn buildings they designed, those awful, awful things that they shoved poor people into, then they might not design them that way. I mean, maybe that should be a requirement. If you're going to design these buildings and get government money, first thing, you're going to have to live in the damn thing for 5 years. That might discourage some people from actually applying. So Lucretius, like many Dorking types today, is anti-religious. So in that, he has a bias that distorts his view of humanity. If you read, I mean, I believe you said he was very dark, Brendan.
Yes. The whole first part of the first book is him essentially saying religion is pretty, stupid, and if you believe in it, you're not a clear thinker.
The end of the book, though, with the plague in Athens, it would help to actually therefore believe in a God, because the pain that they were going through and some of the afflictions that they actually suffered were horrendous. So it would just maybe give them, it's almost like a drug in the sense of giving me something else to believe in other than this pain that I'm facing now, which is eventually going to kill me.
And we don't know that
pretty horrific plague. By the sound,
it was
pretty gross. Those descriptions.
Yes, way worse than COVID. But they had masks, and not quite the same as the medieval ones. They didn't have the bird mask, but they had ugly masks. They just weren't terribly functional. And they had those things that look like Ku Klux Klan ones you put over your head too, like a bag over your head. But yeah, so the aesthetic and the imaginative, it's more than just simple. Why do we exist? And let's go out there and enjoy sort of the low banal sort of anti-spiritualism that is just the pleasure seeking for the moment. There's something more. And sometimes it's actually better not to seek happiness. I know that sounds counterintuitive to a lot of people, but sometimes there is benefit in pain. Sometimes when you're struggling, when you're doing something difficult, then that actually has more meaning and more value.
Well, it's almost like the immediate happiness as opposed to the longer term happiness. There can be struggle in a journey where the happiness is in the distance and you're working towards that, but that can be a really hard journey and something that causes you a lot of pain and stress and emotion, when it would be much easier to go immediate pleasure now and kind of drop everything and not worry about the long-term goal.
Happiness is just, it's momentary though, isn't it? It's only the moment. And
unless you're Aristotle and Plato and remember Creon, etc., what about the idea that you're not happy until the end of your life? I mean, you might have pleasure.
There's nothing else to worry about.
But until you're dead and you've actually been able, someone can evaluate your life and go, you didn't get cancer and die hideously, or you didn't have a plague, or you didn't end up in a war, or you didn't end up XYZ. So yes, that was happy. So we don't actually know until the end. So
it's more like, I would say it's more like, while it is in the instant, it's also the aggregation of everything from the past. And you can know that if you go through this journey of sometimes being happy, sometimes being unhappy, that at the end, there's going to be more aggregate happiness by pursuing this path that maybe makes me quite unhappy for a while. then that is worthwhile.
I'd even go beyond that. Not everyone even seeks happiness at the end. So I will let you do some homework and try and find out. I've mentioned this one before, but there are some quotes about life to be envied versus life to be admired. So an example is if you look at someone who is living what seems to be the perfect life, where they're just going through pleasure and enjoyment and everything's good. They're rich, they've inherited everything, everyone treats them well, they're beautiful, they enjoy. That might be what you could consider a life to envy. It is good. It looks great. They've got the yacht. Everyone wants to click like on Instagram for them. But that could be very different from the life to admire. So the life to admire could be something like Reverend King, who died violently, or a certain president who ended up freeing the slaves, although that wasn't the actual reason he went to war. And other people like that. So these individuals can be said to have a life to admire, but we wouldn't want to be them, so to speak. We can look at them and go, wow, that is a wonderful life. You've done some great things. And someone might ask you then, would you like to live that life? And you go, fuck no. No, they can have it. Glad that they're there. I mean, and there are many of those through history. So people who strive and do more and embrace a form of heroism, not always the sort of childish Achilles type heroism of chucking quite so many emotions, but a form of it. So is Lucretius, is he really scientific? And I'll say he's as scientific as many of the current physicists who embrace sort of multiverse theory and other such things and try and fit a world without anything more. Because all they're doing is going beyond agnostic thought into a different religion, and atheism is a religion. It's a belief. I don't care what people say. They'll go, we believe in the non-existence of God, and then they fill up a whole lot of other things based on scientism, and their non-God becomes their God. It's a nihilistic God. It's an empty God. It's Cthulhu, the dead God. But I don't care if your dead Cthulhu God is a non-God, he's still a God. So Lucretius talks of an infinite universe, matter and the void continuing through space and time. But the existing universe doesn't really fulfill this model. And when we talk about a universe with all these little bumps and it just must keep going and shrinking, and what we're really doing is trying to fit our universe into an idea we want, rather than trying to understand. So the universe has a big bang. We know that, but we don't understand beyond the first fraction of a second. And we don't really know whether it's going to keep expanding, and we don't really know whether it's going to collapse. I mean, it might keep expanding. Then what? It might have a boring heat death of nothingness. It might, the other thing then, it might rip apart. Well, these are ideas. Now, that is actually good. The fact that people are doing that is good, but once they embrace them as an answer without any explanation, that's bad. So stopping because we don't like the theological is actually a negative. Balanced cosmic systems aren't equal, aren't unchanging, and aren't infinite. We know that much. Quantum theory, although it might be posited in change and doing all this other stuff, also means that stuff pops into existence and pops out of existence. It just happens to balance. So question, why? Why does it balance? If a particle can pop in and out of existence, why the hell does it actually exist? Why haven't we got more? So they're all questions that need answers. So contradictions shouldn't exist. I'm with Aristotle on this one. If there's a contradiction, there's a problem. So Ayn Rand was also the same. She was neo-Aristotelian, and I'm the same that way. When you find logical contradictions, you have found a problem with the theory. So atoms and particles are unlimited in number. That's wrong too. They're big number. Okay, so we're talking huge, but it's not infinite, not unbounded. The universe, we don't know what the limit is. We sort of have some idea, but it's not infinite. There's something at the end. So although in curved space, it's probably the end is it loops, but I mean, there's a size somehow. So does the swerve of atoms create quantum theory and free will? As I said, the problem is if we have an infinite unbounded space, we don't have free will anymore. So I know he added this to try and reinvigorate the work of Epicurus and go, we have free will. And then he destroyed it again by making it infinite. See how these things happen. We actually add our own contradictions in trying to get around problems. So Lucretius wanted to have free will, but not God or deities. So you make it, there's atomic swerves and something like quantum theory, and the universe is infinite and it goes on forever. But now we have a contradiction again. We either have free will or we have infinity. And if we, I mean, I like to believe I've got free will. I mean, I've studied enough on cognition of mind to know that it's not quite as people say, and that I'm just doing what my past says. I change my past. I study. I actually have guided study, so I don't just randomly pick courses. Although I actually do sometimes randomly pick courses because otherwise I'll get myself into a rut. But there's a combination of adding randomness for purpose to actually outcomes. Now, philosophy of emptiness leads to a very Nietzschean nihilism. We'll get to him a long way from now, but we will eventually get to old Nietzsche there. Many sort of states of depression, big giant mustaches, big huge mustaches, obviously. I don't actually know whether Lucretius had a huge mustache at any point in his life, but Romans were generally clean shaven, but never know. He might have broke away and had a Nietzschean mustache, but meaningless, empty, no real reason. So you answered this one, I believe, Brendan. Why are Greek concepts difficult to express in Latin?
His answer was that it sounded like there's a lack of vocabulary in Latin that is not can't really match a lot of the words in that the Greeks were using to describe their philosophy. And as a bilingual person, I can certainly sympathize with that. Like there are words in French that there's simply no equivalent in English. And, you know, when learning those words, it kind of bends your mind a bit because you can see the meaning of the word, but there's no way to describe the exact translation to somebody in English. And I think what he was saying is that there's a paucity of deep vocabulary in Latin that led to it being quite difficult to explain some of the concepts.
I would agree. I mean, part of the Latin culture was actually very much an engineering culture, war engineering, very focused and pragmatic. The Greeks, on the other hand, were a bit different. So the Greeks were what our university life should be like. I mean, not all Greeks, but some of them, some of the Athenians, some of the other Corinthians, etc. The concept was people who think, people who basically pontificate for a living. So that comes up with a whole lot more. So even in English, we have a lot of words that people don't understand anymore. Even now, we misuse them. We aren't training people correctly. We're moving towards teaching the vernacular. And in that, it might allow more people to get through to a certain level, but that level is just lowered. So no language transmits correctly across each one. And don't believe some of the sort of false stories about there are 50 versions of the word snow in sort of Eskimo language or Inuit language, there's not actually, there are actually more words for the word snow in English than there are in Inuit. It's just people have assumed they must have lots of versions of the word for snow. They're actually wrong. If you actually find out, English has one of the most descriptive sort of versions of describing snow ever. And it's not because we have a lot of snow in England. It's because we have a lot of sort of people who pontificated in the past and made up words by writing novels and romance novels and other such things. And you will find that authors do this. We have a lot of words because, like Milton, he made up words. He made up quite a lot of words. Sort of the hubbub of hell was actually made up by him. Other words come because of things that occur in history. So the word guy, for instance, if someone's a guy, well, that relates to Guy Fawkes. After Guy Fawkes Day, people would wear the mask and run around town being silly, and still do. And you would be one of the guys wearing that mask. And after generations, everyone forgot that, well, if you're not wearing the mask anymore, then you're one of the guys. So the reality is language is dynamic and we keep adding things. And if we've got a dynamic literary culture, we'll end up with a great many ways of describing things. So what do you think nature requires as a way of life?
Now, nature requires things to die and decay. So then they can be absorbed and then they can be reborn.
So this is something that is very different to many of the Silicon Valley, especially plutocrats out there, who seem to think that we can upload ourselves to a computer and be the same. I'm sorry, there's no such thing as immortality. Even if we extend our lives, which I hope we do, we die. We're going to die. Get over it. I'm sorry, Mr. Zuckerberg, all you guys in Twitter, you're going to die. Accept it. Even if you find a way of accelerating, sort of living even longer, and you get to be 1,000 years of age, you will die. Eventually, things die. This solar system will die. I know that sounds dark to many people, but it's going to happen. Eventually, this damn universe dies, so we can't be immortal because, oh, we'll find another one. Well, yeah, I don't think so.
Immortality does seem like some type of hell, you know. Once you've lived everything, what else is there?
But have you lived everything? I mean, honestly, or if you go back to the ideal life for a sort of Egyptian around the time of Ramses, it was the same. What did you want in the afterlife? Oh, we keep living the way that we have been.
Except all of the bad stuff is gone and there's just an infinite supply of beer. And
well, not infinite, but it's unbounded.
Well, yes.
I mean, if you drank 3 things of beer, you drank 3 things of beer for the rest of existence.
Have you ever seen there's a film called Highlander with Christopher Lambert, and he plays...
I have, yes.
Yes, there can be only one.
Yeah.
Yes, it was good to start, and then, well...
Yeah, no, 2 and 3 were...
And they kept making them
one
worse and
worse. Yeah, I mean, so you've killed everyone, and you're the last, and now there's someone else. Oh, okay. Thank you, Hollywood. Oh, it's like Dallas. Oh, it's a dream sequence. So anyway, I'll leave you to continue with this, but we'll ask one last question before I go. We've got a word down the bottom there. Who spent some time looking it up?
Right. Well, it's a genus of moth, but in philosophy...
Probably want philosophy.
Yeah, in philosophy, it's a state of quality of being homogeneous in elements of first principles. Likeness of identity. No, likeness or identity of parts. I have to write this down because I knew I'd forget it. But Lucretius assumed that the atoms constituting a substance must themselves have the same observed properties of that substance, i.e., atoms of water would be wet, atoms of iron would be solid, etc. Wool would be soft, etc.
Yep. Unfortunately, he didn't quite get that.
Not quite correct.
Not quite correct. He was close. Yes, there are atoms, but they go even further than water, and water is really 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. And if you got to that point, you would have been sort of semi-accurate, and then we'd have to go down into where you get accurate in that, yes, those quarks are basically the same as the other quarks until we get even further. But at least we know that electrons don't seem to break down into anything else. Neither do neutrons and a few other base particles, but hey, we can get there eventually. So, okay. Till next time. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Hope you all learned something, and yeah, we'll keep
Definitely.
going.
It's been very interesting to sort of see this idea that you know, some people that there can be this view that human nature and the way that we are can come from the constituency of what we are made of, rather than the idea that what we are made of is something that sort of captures a human nature and allows it to express itself. And
I think it shows that it doesn't matter how much, like how many years forward we are or advancement in technologies, we are still the same in our thought processes. There are still...
Well, we are still this ape who likes to grab tools and technology. And some of us have seemed to forget that what really differentiates us isn't the tools, it's the rational thought. And if we don't teach people rational thought, then we just remain those little chimpanzees telling stories and banging rocks.
So that's where we're a species with amnesia comes from.
Yes.